kind of getting to know animal behavior as a field of study, I generally think about animal behavior as the field of behavioral ecology because partly I'm an ecologist, but partly it just, for me, animal behavior is easier to approach if you think about the ecological challenges of the organism doing the behavior. So, for example, um, if a bird is singing, you can ask yourself a set of questions about that bird singing. But if you're doing that in the absence of thinking about what that bird's goals might be in terms of its reproductive success, survival, avoiding predation, et cetera, there's not a lot of questions you can really pose about the act of singing without thinking about all those other things. So, animal behavior kind of deals with behavior, but you have to include the ecology of the species in that. Otherwise, the behavior doesn't really make all that much sense. Behavior is capable of evolving, so organisms are not behaving today the way they behaved a millennia ago necessarily. And so behavior is underlain by genes. We'll talk about that a little bit today. There are genes that affect behavior. So that also factors into this. And then because behavior is genetically based and can evolve, we also have to think about the underlying genetics of it. And all of this kind of exists in this central place, behavioral ecology. You could certainly think about nothing but the behavior of an organism and its genetic determinants, but then you would be more of a behavioral geneticist who may or may not have any interest in what that behavior has to do with the survival and reproduction of an organism out in nature. You're just interested in the behavior itself. For example, my wife is interested in copper toxicity, and she works on fruit flies, and she has discovered an interesting thing that is evidently kind of new, that fruit flies that are highly resistant to copper, when they sense copper, they also eat less of it. So they have genes that allow them to metabolize copper and isolate copper and excrete copper from their bodies, but then they also have some genes that affect behavior such that in the presence of copper, they eat less of it. Sensitive flies lack the variants of the genes that allow them to handle copper physiologically, but they also have correlated genetic aspects of behavior that also cause them to eat more copper when copper is present than the resistant flies. So she's interested in that from a toxicology standpoint, but a behavioral ecologist would be interested in that and asking, okay, well, what does this do to fruit flies living out there in nature? And fruit flies in nature come into contact with environmental toxins all the time. One of the places they come into contact with these toxins is at things like fruit orchards. So behavioral ecology would look at those behaviors in the context of how is an organism surviving, reproducing, et cetera, out in the world. So you certainly can do work that only includes one of these two bubbles or three of these bubbles, but behavioral ecology as a whole would in theory involve all of these bubbles where they overlap with one another. So let me see if I can get this other thing. I want to show you some videos. Let's see if we can get this to work or not. We cannot. Let me. Oh yeah, here we go. All right. These are embedded links in the PowerPoint, so you can go back and play these for yourself. These are behaviors of anoles, which is a type of lizard that lives in the southern United States and then throughout the tropics. So green anole, Anolis carolinensis. This is a male anole. These are videos that are submitted by human beings, and so um, hold on. Amazing Animal Adventures! Yay! Let's skip all the precursors and just get to the video. So that thing underneath his throat is called a dewlap, and they're different colors in different species. So you can tell an anoles species partly on the basis of the color of its dewlap. Let's put it into that because the piano music is killing me. I want to kill it, but I can't seem to kill it. Go away, go away. All right. So you saw those two sets of behaviors. There are behaviors that involve expanding this dewlap, but they also involve the animal basically pushing its body up and down with its front legs primarily, but also a little bit with the back legs as well. These things are called head bobs or push-ups. Head bobbing is more about the head bobbing back and forth. Push-ups are when they use the legs to raise and lower the entire body. And these behaviors can be graphed in a sense in terms of you can make what they call ethograms out of them. It shows you where head bobs are occurring, where the dewlap is being expanded and for how long, whether the head is raised or dipped, so raised up, dipped down, and so there are these little bouts of head bobbing followed by periods when it's still, followed by bouts of head bobbing. The dewlap being extended versus retracted. And you can create these ethograms for different species, and different species do these behaviors differently from one another. And so one of the questions that you might, well, there are a series of questions that you might have about this behavior. What would be some of them? They got rid of the whiteboard that was on the wall. There used to be a whiteboard painted on the wall. Questions that you might have about this behavior. Okay, so kind of what's its function? Now you notice that in this question I've separated these three different components of the behavior so that you can concentrate on one of them or you can concentrate on them all at once. Either way, it doesn't really matter for our purposes today. What other questions might you have?
My personal like, does the new lab size vary?
Why might you want to know the answer to that question? What are your thoughts Like, what are you headed for in that question? So, does dewlap size have something to do with your ability to attract a mate? Would female anoles find that a more attractive trait than a male with a smaller dewlap? What other kind of questions might you ask? It's the disadvantage of only two of you being here. So they're doing this. In one video, they just showed you the male doing it. In the other video, there was like commentary describing what else was going on in the cage. Um, in terms of the function of these displays is actually twofold. One of the functions is to attract a mate. What might the other function be? So you can also use this dewlap display to males to basically say, hey, dude, this is my territory, get out of my territory. And part of the thing of what happens with the dewlap is it does make the animal look bigger. And a lot of times you'll see two anoles that will face off, and they face one another, but they don't face one another head on. They face one another side to side, and they're looking at one another with their side eye, and they're like, how big are you? How big are you? How big are you? How big are you? And then the small one runs away. And so they can use these behaviors to actually de-escalate a conflict before the conflict comes to biting and things like this, because they can just take the measure of one another in a sense and say, well, I'm bigger and burlier than you. You can come over here and try and bite me, but I'm going to bite you back, and you risk incurring injury if you decide to fight me for my territory because I'm bigger than you. And so you can use this thing for the same display behavior can have multiple functions in terms of what the doer of the behavior is trying to accomplish. So that raises another kind of question that could be asked of these types of behaviors. And they're kind of answered in that first question of getting at what's the purpose of the function. Do those behaviors make the animal more conspicuous or less conspicuous? Running around, putting out this big red flag, bopping your head up and down. Really, I think it makes them more conspicuous, actually. They're moving around a lot. They're putting out these bright colors. It kind of makes them stand out. Oh, you meant that. Okay. You said less conspicuous. Okay, all right. Because you want to be conspicuous if you're trying to attract a female, and also you want to be conspicuous if you're trying to deter a male from coming and taking your territory. So do you want to be doing these behaviors all the time? Why not? Avery, you're shaking your head no. Hmm? So you don't want to be doing them all the time because you might be giving away your position to predators who might want to come in and eat you. Bird flying by is like, oh, there's a lizard. Go snag him and eat him. So what's a question that you could ask about this behavior, knowing that this behavior probably has potentially negative consequences as well as potentially good consequences of doing the behavior? Yeah, under what conditions do you display these behaviors? What is the proximate cue that causes you to begin engaging in in this behavior. When do you do this? What stimulus are you responding to that prompts you to engage in this particular behavior? Other questions that we could ask is, we know what some of the benefits are if you're doing this behavior. You get a mate. What are some of the costs? Does doing the behavior actually increase the chance of being predated on, becoming prey for something else? There are all kinds of questions that you could ask about annulled display behavior. So Nico Tinbergen had these 4 questions. They're talked about in the first chapter of your textbook, and they're talked about in the chapter in this article from Bateson and Lalane. And these questions of Tinbergen's are, the way Tinbergen talked about them were questions of causation, usually the proximate mechanisms. So in the case of the annuls, a causation question might ask, how exactly does the dewlap get extended? What is the skeletal basis of the dewlap? How do the muscles attach to the dewlap in such a way that the dewlap extends itself? What is the pattern of the head bobbing and the dewlap extension, et cetera, et cetera? How far is it extended? What are the biomechanics of the extension? That's a question of causation, which kind of gets at how the behavior actually operates. It doesn't say anything about what its adaptive function is. It doesn't say anything about how it might have evolved. It doesn't say anything about how it develops over time. Some behaviors develop over time. They change with the development of the organism. Other ones don't. Did all anoles, did the earliest lizard that gave rise to anoles have a dewlap? Or was this found in other groups of lizards as well? And so it's inherited from a common ancestor. Does it actually have adaptive value? Does doing this behavior actually get you more mates? Or does everybody have an equal chance of getting mates regardless of whether they engage in this? So causation deals with the proximate mechanisms of the behavior. Development or ontogeny deals with the development of it. How does this behavior change over time? What is the adaptive value of the behavior? In what way does it advance the fitness of the individual who engages in the behavior? And then, what is the evolutionary history of this behavior? Is this a behavior that it simply inherited from common ancestors and it has this kind of phylogenetic inertia? Everybody from that common ancestor does this behavior. Or is it something that evolved in that group of organisms in particular? And so these are kind of Tinbergen's sort of big fundamental questions that you can ask about any given behavior. And in this paper by Bateson and Lalane, they're looking at these 4 questions through a more modern lens and kind of evaluating, do these 4 questions about behavior still have value? What is the value? Do they need to be updated in any way? And they're also advocating for changing some of the terminology and how we talk about these 4 questions. So I want to take a couple of minutes and just point out some changing terminology, I guess. So just a brief translation for you. They pose these questions differently in this paper than the language that Tinbergen used. So the first question here that they have in their paper is, what is the behavior for? This is a question that they relate to the adaptive significance of Tinbergen. The question that they have described as how did it develop? This is Tinbergen's question of development or ontogeny. Ontogeny is just the fancy pants word for development. The development that individual organisms go through as they go from a zygote to an adult. If you go home on break and parents want to know what you're getting in terms of education, you can say, oh, I learned about ontogeny, and then you'll sound smart and they feel like your money's going to a good cause. How did it evolve? Deals with the phylogenetic or evolutionary history of it. We'll talk about phylogeny probably on Wednesday. Wednesday. And then the last of these questions has to do with how does it work? This is the question of causation. And for me, causation was always the weirdest of Tinbergen's questions, because causation can mean, for me, a couple of things. It can mean what prompts the behavior to be displayed by an individual. And so what's the stimulus that elicits the behavior, which to me is something very different than the mechanics of how does the behavior actually get accomplished, which seems to me like more of a morphological and physiological sort of question. So these are kind of their reformulation of Tinbergen's 4 questions. And a couple of things that I want to call attention to in the paper is when we think about the adaptive significance of a behavior, we have to think about its current utility. And they drove this point home pretty strongly. There was a paper a long time ago now, by your standards, 1982, by a couple of people named Stephen Gould and Elizabeth Verba. They were trying to get at what we actually mean when we use the term adaptation. And we talked about this a little bit in evolution ecology, but we talked about it so briefly that you probably don't remember the conversation. I don't expect you to remember the conversation. But for Gould and Verba, they concentrated even way back in, so this paper here was published in, when was it published? 2013. 50 years after Tinbergen wrote his paper. Gould and Verba talked about current utility all the way back in 1982 or 83. And they wanted to concentrate in terms of how they defined an adaptation, as an adaptation was a feature that not only enhanced the fitness of the individual who possesses that feature or that trait, but it also was a trait that had evolved for its current utility. So the way to think about this is think about your thumb. We have an opposable thumb. What was probably the original driver of an opposable thumb as opposed to non-opposable digits? What does the thumb gain us? Yeah, it enables us to grab things and grab things firmly. And if you're a primate and you're climbing a lot, it enables you to climb a tree. Maybe climb a tree to get away from a predator. So the original driver of evolution probably had to do with gripping in the context of climbing. But now I can grip things, so I can not only climb a tree, but I can also pick up a stick and do what with it?
Like defend yourself.
You defend yourself against predators. You can whack a competitor over the head, get his territory, take his mates, take all his food, whack him over the head because you have a firm grip on the stick. What else can you do with your thumb? Even further divorced from the stick, because the stick is still just a piece of a tree, so it's still an adaptation for grasping. So in that way, climbing and beating your neighbor with a stick, both would be within this original function of increasing the strength of the grasp. What else do we use our thumbs for? No, if you're standing on the side of the road and you're doing this, what are you trying to do? You guys probably don't do this because, yeah, you guys probably don't hitchhike because it's perceived as dangerous nowadays. We use the thumb for hitchhiking. What else do you use your thumb for? Pick up your thing. You use your thumbs for texting. So the fact that you have an opposable thumb makes texting easier, but it's not an adaptation for texting because that's not the utility that it evolved for. That's a current utility, but it's not the original reason that the opposable thumb evolved. Nor is hitchhiking. Texting might increase your fitness because you might be able to text somebody and get a date. That date eventually leads to sex. That eventually leads to having a baby. So you have increased your fitness as a result of texting. Hitchhiking might decrease your fitness because you get picked up by a serial killer and you end up dead in a ditch somewhere. So the thumb can still influence fitness, but in the 21st century, it influences our fitness in very different ways than it did when we were just coming out of the trees as evolving primates. Even into the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, we still largely used our thumb for its original purpose, which is grasping things more firmly. So this idea of current utility is important for these authors. And strikingly, they don't really talk about Gould and Verba, I don't think, in this paper, but certainly I can see the fingerprint of Gould and Verba on their thinking. Oh yeah, there it is. Citation number 20, Gould and Verba, 1982, Exaptation, a Missing Term in the Science of Form. That's where they're getting these ideas about current utility being important. So you can have adaptations that then become co-opted for other functions. And sometimes these things get us in trouble as humans. If we think about human behavior, there are all sorts of behaviors that humans engage in that don't necessarily serve us very well because we are confronted with a new environment. Our evolution is slow enough that our evolution hasn't caught up with the environment as it changes around us. So, for example, when we think about people dying from heart disease, part of our issues with heart disease is terrible diet. We eat too much, we don't exercise enough, and that causes heart problems. But part of it is also stress. And so when you're stressed, your heart beats faster, and the more beats you have going per minute, the faster the heart wears out. And you can literally kill yourself from stress. Your heart beats too much, too fast, too strong, causes higher blood pressure. The higher blood pressure wears out the muscles in your arteries that are designed to kind of hold that blood in the vessels themselves. As a result, your arteries get hard because they're constantly containing that increased blood pressure. Stress can, in a sense, be one of the factors that causes you to die ultimately. Well, there's nothing wrong with a stress response. Stress responses were probably key to our survival during our early evolution, because when a lion is attacking you, what do you want? You want your heart rate to speed up because you want to pump blood to your legs because you want to be able to have enough energy and enough oxygen to climb the tree and get away from the lion. But escaping a lion And taking an exam, for example, those are both stressful events, but your body doesn't know the difference. Even though your body may respond to those two things in similar ways, you get stressed about an exam because it's a stressful event. If you do that in the same way that you would if you were being attacked by a predator, that's ultimately bad for you in the end. So you have this physiological response that just doesn't fit with the current environment that you are in. And there are all kinds of things that we could talk about where humans are concerned where this is the case. Chronic stress is ultimately bad for you because your body is having a response to your environment that usually in our evolutionary history was episodic and relatively uncommon. And now we put our bodies through that constantly. And our bodies weren't made to do that. We're still responding to driver's tests, exams, being disciplined by your parents, et cetera, as if we were being attacked by a lion, and that's just not good. We need to ramp that down, but we're incapable of ramping that down because we have this evolutionary history where that response was good and needed, but it wasn't needed all the time. And so this phylogenetic inertia that we talk about. Your book talks about these 4 questions in the context of birdsong. Birdsong is complex behavior. We can ask each of these questions about birdsong. So let's begin with the easiest one. How does birdsong work? When a bird sings, what's going on in the brain of a bird? When does a bird sing? How does a bird sing? This is all the causation thing. What do birds sing in response to? Think about caching and shrikes. When do the shrikes cache? Around breeding season. So one of the answers to the question of causation is birds are responding probably to things like changing day length that indicate the onset of warmer weather, the onset of more food availability, the onset of breeding season. So one of the answers to causation, which is just when are they going to sing, deals with actual environmental cues that prompt the beginning of singing. Once they go to sing, they have a structure, the syrinx. Their vocal cords, rather than being located up at the top of their throat, their vocal cords are in a thing called the syrinx rather than a larynx. It's down at the base of the trachea, where the trachea branches into the bronchi, the first initial bronchi that go into the 2 lungs. And it's located down here in the chest, at the top of the lungs rather than at the top of the trachea. Presumably, that gives them stronger air pressure going through those vocal cords, giving them more volume, et cetera, et cetera. So we can think about the anatomy of singing and how that is related to the behavior of singing. So I kind of walked you through causation. You guys walk me through development. How does development of song work based on what they talk about in the chapter?
Obviously, at some point it became more desirable to be able to sing than not, right? Like that's kind of what you're asking.
So that's actually more about maybe adaptive significance. I'm thinking about development. So do baby birds sing? No, they don't. They chirp and squawk and do all kinds of things to get the attention of the parent to feed them, which is a whole another set of behaviors, but it's not singing. That's what we call begging behavior. How do Do birds innately know how to sing? Or if you took a bird and raised it in isolation from other birds, would it be able to develop the song that is specific to its species? Think about you. Did you pop out of your mother's womb knowing how to speak English? No, what did you do for a long time? A long time. Hmm?
Listened and picked up on what was happening around.
Yeah, you listened to what was happening around you, and then for a long time, what do babies do in terms of vocalization? Hmm? They babble. Ba 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 ba. Coo 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 coo. They practice the sounds that they hear, and over time, their brain develops. They become able to put those sounds together in the ways that they hear the adults around them putting those sounds together. And over time, you learn language partly because people are trying to get you to learn it. People are trying to teach you because the dads are going, say dada, and the moms are going, say mama. And so you become to associate dada and mama with the dude parent and the female parent. Um, but you pick up all these other things that are less obvious than that as a baby, as you're acquiring language. And eventually you go from babbling to forming small words, to forming bigger words, to forming small sentences, to forming more complex sentences, until all of a sudden, almost like magic, all of a sudden you are a human who can communicate, as opposed to a human can only babble and we have to guess at what the meanings of those babbles are. If you took a snapshot of a baby at 3 months old and then took a snapshot of that baby at 5 years old, you'd be like, miracle! Like that human finally learned how to learn language. But with us, because you're with the baby as it develops, you see that change gradually, so it doesn't strike you how big a difference it is when you just take a snapshot here and a snapshot there. So baby humans, learn language over time. If you take a human baby and put it in an environment where nobody ever talks around it, what happens to the verbal cognitive development of that baby? It ends up not talking. It ends up not knowing how to talk. It has trouble talking the rest of its life. It has trouble picking up the skill of reading because it didn't get that language, that linguistic input as it was developing. You can seriously set back the mental development of a baby by just not communicating with it. If you learn nothing else in this class, if you guys become parents, talk to your babies, read them stories, even when they're so young that you know for a fact that they're not understanding a word that you're saying. Because you talk to your dogs and cats, right? They don't understand a word you're saying. You can condition them to respond to commands in stereotypical ways, but they don't understand the word stop or down. They know that stop or down or sit is a sound that they associate with an expected fixed behavioral pattern. But they don't know what stop means. They don't know what down means. They don't know what sit means. They don't know what shake my hand means. But they know when they hear shake my hand, they put their paw out because you've trained them to do that. You've given them this conditioned response. So you can seriously set back the development of humans by not talking to them when they're really, really young. Reading them stories and things like this. Is that the same with birds? Does it tell you that it's the same way with birds? Point two on page 2. Are you looking at it? You don't have
I don't have my book.
you don't have your book?
I was looking at the paper.
Oh yeah, it's not in the paper. It's in the book. This is now in the book. Birds learn song. They learn song from hearing members of their own species in the environment that they grow up in um, produce that call. Turns out there were a series of experiments back in the 1960s and 70s where they took baby birds and put them in isolation so that they could not hear the calls of their conspecifics, members of their same species. And there's this narrow window of mental development for birds. And if they don't hear their species call, once you've missed that window, it's very difficult to get those individuals to reproduce their species specific call once they've passed through that window. It's what ornithologists refer to as forming a template of sound that gets stored in their memory. And when birds begin calling, when they get old enough that they start calling, they begin to practice their calls, and their initial calls don't sound anything like that template, but they have that mental template, and they continue practicing their calls until the calls that they're creating match the sounds that they remember from childhood during this narrow window of development. This is why you find dialects in birdsong. White-crowned sparrow that you see in one part of its range will have one call, and in another part of the range will have a different call, but those two calls are called by all of the white-crowned sparrows in one part of the range, and they're called by all of the white-crowned sparrows in another part of the range, but those two populations have slightly or sometimes radically different songs. And so you might be able to identify birds by song in one part of their range and then go to another part of their range and have trouble as a human because the calls are different. And so we have what the ornithologists refer to as dialects in bird song. So behavior develops. It doesn't change. It isn't constant over the life of an organism. It can be, but in many cases it's not. Birdsong is an example of it not. Obviously, what's the adaptive function of birdsong? What's that? You can attract a mate. What else can you use it for? On the board. It's also used to it is on the board. Oh no, it isn't. I erased it. Sorry, I erased it. It was on the board earlier.
Um, is it another thing like it would make them look bigger, but make them more intimidating?
Because they also use song to defend territories. They advertise. You'll see birds fly out to the edges of their territories, fly out to a post or a tree, call, fly to another part of the territory, call. Males spend a certain amount of time just defending their territory. Oftentimes this defense isn't through fighting, it's just going to the outlying areas of your territory and advertising the fact, this is mine. From this stick inward, this is mine. From this fence post inward is mine. From this mailbox inward is mine. In the Joseph and Pinchot paper, they talked about putting models of birds up in near the shrike's territories until they got close enough that the shrike would come and attack it. Birds can do that where they actively attack another bird, but they can also do it by basically just flying out and calling at other birds as well. So it can be territorial defense. How did bird song evolve in birds? Your book tells you that early birds had relatively unsophisticated vocal apparatus. The vocal apparatus got more and more sophisticated over time. It shifted its location in the trachea over time. And so once again, modern day birds have very different call patterns than ancient birds did, and we know this from looking at fossil evidence of birds. And so there is a evolutionary history of bird song. Some birds, like starlings, have a very wide, um, what we call vocal repertoire. Starlings make all kinds of noises, all kinds of calls. Mockingbirds make all kinds of calls as well. In some cases, all the members of a particular family will have good facility with making lots of calls, whereas in other cases, only one member of the family of birds will be able to do that. Those families that have lots of members that have a wide vocal repertoire, they're probably inheriting that vocal repertoire from a common ancestor, and then everybody who descended from that common ancestor has that ability. Starlings are in one of those families. Cuckoos are in one of those families. Parrots, obviously, are one of those families where all the members of the family have the ability to do this in many cases. So that can explain a lot about the ability to do that, is you just inherited it from your ancestors. So those are Tinbergen's 4 questions interpreted through the lens of starling vocal behavior. What questions do you have about that? Okay. More clips. Let's see if I can get these to work. Oh, the video is not available anymore. No! I did not check these clips to see if they are still out there. Oh, yeah. Okay, all right. And my cursor has disappeared, so now I can't point at anything. Oh, there it is. See if we can do this. All right. For whatever reason, nothing is working video-wise. Oh, there it goes. Why? Have you guys seen the Lion King? So you know the story. The wildebeest come. Ultimately, the king is going to try and save his son, and ultimately is damaged, tries to escape, is looking for help from his brother Scar, and Scar basically sends him to his death. All right. So Simba has survived. Mufasa is dead. And Scar, because he's evil and diabolical, convinces Simba that the best thing for Simba is to get out of town. Of course, what does Scar then do as soon as Simba leaves? What's that? Well, he becomes king, but before he does that, what does he do? Run away, never return. The hyenas come along, who are in league with Scar in this case, and they're tasked with hunting down Simba and doing what to him? Killing him. So they're playing fast and loose with a behavior that is present in um, in lions, and this behavior is infanticide. And so, strangely, the Lion King, this cherished story from your childhood, is actually about this real world behavior that we see in lions, but we also see it in other groups of organisms called infanticide. And in the real world, you don't recruit a league of hyenas to come and off your rival's offspring, but what happens in lions is lions are generally they live in prides. The pride is made up of a male, a number of female, and the offspring of those number of females. And virtually all of those offspring are the offspring of that single male. So when a male is in a pride, new males, younger males in most cases, will come into the pride and challenge that resident male for control of the pride. If that young male is successful in driving off the old male, the first thing that he will do is he will go through that pride and he will kill off all of the baby lions that are in that pride. Take over a pride, get rid of the adult male, kill all the babies. Infanticide. It's a horrible thing to watch. It's a Disney movie. So the question you can have about infanticide is, why do lions do this? And we can interpret this behavior, once again, through Tinbergen's 4 questions. What are some possible reasons why male lions kill off the existing offspring after they take over a pride from another male? It doesn't have to do with imprinting. At least it's not as far as I know. So those offspring are not the male's offspring. So one of the reasons that they might do this is by removing those males, it reduces competition for food in the pride, such that only offspring that are genetically related to the male are getting the benefits of the food that goes around the pride. Because there are fewer offspring, there's more food to go around. Females will be in better condition, they will be more likely to have offspring, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one possible reason. What are some other possible reasons? Actually, it ends up not, once again, as far as we know, not having to do with that. Other ideas. Nothing wrong with that idea. That's a perfectly good idea. It's just not what we know. This is a male having just killed a baby cub and a pride that it took over. All these mothers are now without offspring. What's that? Yeah, and so one of the things that happens when this happens is they all go into estrus at the same time. They all become reproductively active, and in very short order, that new male can basically mate with all of those females and produce a new slew of offspring. And in this case, those offspring are all going to be his rather than the previous males. So synchrony of estrus is one of the reasons that this might happen. So there are a set of possible explanations as to why this behavior occurs in lions. Females are synchronous in their estrus. This is caused by chemical cues that the females are giving off with one another, but it's also prompted by takeovers by males. As a result of this, you get better cub survival because there's not competition with the previous existing cubs. Young males survive better because they have greater reproductive success when they leave the pride and go off and find their own prides because they're just in better condition. Takeover males will kill or evict the young. Once again, the females come into estrus and the male removes any of these older cubs. Not only does it remove competition for food, but it also removes potential competition at a later date for control of the pride. As that male that was already an adult and has taken over that pride, any males coming up from the lower ranks is going to be a younger male. As the male that is in charge of the pride ages, there's a potential for him being deposed, not from a male from outside the pride coming in, but competition from within. So once again, we can think about virtually any behavior in terms of long-term, why did this evolve kinds of questions versus short-term, what is the current utility of the behavior versus, how did the behavior develop? What is it about the behavior in terms of how it actually works and functions? So all of these questions, regardless of any behavior you look at, you can put them up against these 4 questions. Now, back to the Bateson and Lelaine paper. Box 1 in the paper, I don't know if you paid much attention to it, but there have been numerous attempts over the years to add questions to Tinbergen's 4 questions. They highlight a couple of pretty good ones. One of the things that Tinbergen's 4 questions don't really deal with very much is the genetics of behavior and how behavior is inherited. Part of this could be because Tinbergen wrote these questions back in 1963. DNA had only been discovered in 1953, so this was really not that long after DNA had been discovered as a genetic material. So genetics in its kind of modern form was really a fledgling field in many ways. They talk about one good question could be, how is the behavior inherited? Another question that they mention is, what is the character? And I was particularly interested in this given our conversation in lab last week. Tinbergen all but proposes this question himself by stressing the importance of observation and description at the outset of his article. Tinbergen wrote, quote, "Contempt for simple observation is a lethal trait in any science." So Tinbergen himself talked about these things that we talked about in lab last week, about the importance of making good observations and developing that skill. We talked about anthropomorphism in lab last week. They also talk about it here in box 1, trying to observe behavior in ways that are divorced from us projecting our own human behavior and motivations onto other organisms. And then the last thing in this paper was these practical implications in box 2. Researchers need to be mindful that current utility need not equate with the original function and that functionality need not be the direct product of natural selection. One of the next things we're going to talk about, the next thing we're going to talk about is natural selection. Presumably, these behaviors have evolved over time in response to selection pressures. But you don't necessarily need to think of natural selection having led to the development of that behavior for its current function. It could have evolved for something totally different and then been co-opted later for that. When Tinbergen was talking, we didn't know a lot about maternal effects. So there are non-genetic traits that can be inherited because, especially in mammals in particular, where you spend a lot of your time being gestated by the female, you can inherit certain aspects of your phenotype that are due to that shared environment that are inherited, but they're not genetic. And these are called maternal effects, and those can really severely affect behavior in some cases. And so that was one of the realizations that Tinberg wasn't capable of talking about back in the day, because there just really wasn't a lot known about it back then. And in some cases, these can be multi-generational. You can have a maternal effect that will sometimes extend 3 generations into the future. That's how strong those maternal effects can be before they finally begin to be dampened out. So these authors argue that these 4 questions are still useful. They advocate for some changes in terminology, and they also advocate for some other things that you might also want to think about in thinking about animal behavior, but they seem to be relatively in favor of Tinbergen's contributions. So next time what we're going to do is we're going to just introduce evolution via natural selection. We're going to talk about fitness consequences with a couple of examples from chapter 1 of the book, but then we're going to delve into the 4 factors of evolutionary change in more detail. So remember, those are mutation, selection, migration, and drift. And while we'll talk a lot in this class about natural selection, we need to be well versed in those other forces of evolutionary change. And that's what we'll work on Wednesday. And then remember that you're reading a literature review by Lima and Dill from 1990 for lab on Thursday, so don't forget about that. Continue reading chapter 1. The latter part of chapter 1 deals with natural selection, and that's the main thing that we're going to be looking at. For Friday, we're going to be talking about how you go about testing hypotheses in animal behavior. That material is in chapter 2. So when you're done reading chapter 1, which it seems like maybe you didn't read carefully enough.
I read it last week. So
Okay, yep. Yeah, reread it. So for Friday, we'll be talking about the material that's in chapter 2. Questions?
Have you posted which of us will be which?
I haven't yet. I need to still do that. All right, then that's all I have for you. You guys are going to research meeting on Zoom here in an hour and 5 minutes, hour and 10 minutes? All right.